Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily. For those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the I-45, which is a highway. What we're specifically going to focus on is a section of this highway that runs through the great state of Texas. This particular segment of road is responsible for approximately 34 murders that we know of, many of which remain unsolved. This is an investigative series that I am embarking on to draw attention to these cases. And if by some miracle we find something groundbreaking and new, great. I doubt that'll happen, but at the very least, I think it's important to push for justice when it comes to the victims and families who've suffered from the I-45 just kind of being unregulated and the inexperience of law enforcement investigating these cases. If you want to support this journey, please feel free to do so. You can do that by liking, commenting, or subscribing. I did have to purchase a newspaper subscription just to get any of the information necessary for this episode. I'll probably complain about it a little bit, so bear with me. But without further ado, we're going to start where all of this began. On June 17th, 1971, a 13-year-old girl, Colette Wilson, very beautiful name, disappeared at a bus stop in the area of County Road 99 and State Highway 6 in Alvin, Texas. Colette had been dropped off at the bus stop by her band director. The Brazosport Facts newspaper reported that Colette had been missing since approximately 12:30 p.m., so early afternoon. Colette had been at a band camp in Pearland, which I believe is in Sugarland as well, in Texas, and was dropped off at this location because it's where her mother usually picked her up. If I recall correctly from some of the newspapers I read, they lived approximately a mile and a half away, so a little bit of a long walk when it comes to walking home from the bus stop, so I can totally understand wanting to pick your kid up and drive them home, especially with her being a 13-year-old girl. Walking by yourself on a highway probably isn't the best. Now, Colette was known to play the clarinet, which I think is absolutely adorable. I myself used to play the trumpet once upon a time. And this was the instrument that she brought with her to band camp. So she had in her possession a clarinet in its black case, along with some sheet music, which again, she got at band camp. Now, this should have been a routine pickup for both Colette and her mother, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case this time. Mrs. Wilson, Colette's mother, stated that she was running late, which happens all the time, and should have just been like every other day. She showed up approximately 10 minutes late, but at that point in time, Colette had already disappeared. Around the same time that Mrs. Wilson got there at 12:30 p.m., she observed a black vehicle leaving the area. The vehicle was allegedly driven by a white male, and she noticed like a dark-haired woman sitting in the back or female sitting in the back of the car. However, she was unable to tell if it was her daughter. Now, some people are like, well, how would you not know, etc., etc. It's the middle of the day. Tinted windows are a pain. I don't know what tint regulations were like back then, but kind of a rule of thumb is that your front passenger windows aren't as tinted as the back portion of your vehicle. You have more of a right to privacy in the back portion of the vehicle. So chances are she wasn't going to get a good look anyways, and on top of that, the car is moving. So Mrs. Wilson told authorities that she observed the vehicle driving southbound on County Road 99 towards Manville Road. At the time of her disappearance, Colette was wearing a Mickey Mouse shirt, purple shorts, and brown chukka boots. Colette was also wearing a gold piece ring, small pearl ear studs, and was actually carrying a rough-out purse with beads and fringe on top of the aforementioned clarinet and sheet music. Now, what stands out about that description is something that I think is kind of universal when it comes to the experience of growing up as a girl, which is that at a certain point, you feel like you're independent enough to try and find your own style, to accessorize, have jewelry, earrings, have a purse. There's this little bit of independence that happens at a certain point in your life where you're like, I have a purse now, like I'm becoming a woman. I can do what I want. I'm a teenager, like I'm older now. But at the same time, you're still very juvenile. You're still very young. You're still very naive. And I think the outfit that Colette was wearing really encapsulates this because she has the jewelry, she has the purse. She's grown up. She's going to band camp, but she still needs to be picked up by her mom. Like, it's just a really interesting juxtaposition that I think is a pretty universal experience for women who obviously were girls once upon a time. Now, back to the case. Mrs. Wilson provided the following description of her daughter at the time of Colette's disappearance, stating that Colette was 5 feet 2 inches tall, 100 pounds, with long dark hair and blue eyes. By midnight, multiple state agencies were canvassing the area for Colette, which is not uncommon. Missing persons cases, especially with children, tend to be taken more seriously than that of adults. And at this point, they had set up roadblocks in the area, trying to get any information that they could, probably looking for the black car that Mrs. Wilson said that she saw. Now, by daylight on the 18th, a helicopter search was actually underway. Unfortunately, nothing was found at the time. And in fact, Colette's body was found 5 months later on November 26, 1971, near the Addicks Reservoir. And in a weird twist of fate, she was just 35 yards, or 32 meters if you're not American, from the location where the body of Gloria Gonzalez was actually discovered. Now, according to another edition of the Brazosport Facts, Colette's body was dumped and found nude. According to authorities at the time, there were no clothing items found on or near Colette's body. There were some other identifying objects that we'll get into later, but nothing about the Mickey Mouse shirt, no underwear, no shorts, as far as I can tell. Now, at the time of locating her body, the cause of death for Colette was unknown. There's some speculation as to what it is, which we'll mention at some point later in the episode, but at this point in time, they weren't sure what caused her death. Now, at the time of locating her body, Colette, she was in a very advanced state of decomposition, as was Gloria. So when the autopsy was done, they were unable to determine if any sort of sexual assault took place. And that's because they were sitting in this kind of swampy, brushy area in the reservoir for such an extended period of time that any bit of evidence pertaining to that would have been either taken away by the environment, the weather, or just with time, and obviously decomposition. At the time, foul play was obviously suspected when it came to Colette's death, but there weren't really any key suspects as far as it goes. I mean, most 13-year-olds don't walk off into a reservoir in the middle of the afternoon and then end up dead and naked. So it was pretty clear that something nefarious had happened here. On April 19th of 1972, it was reported in the same newspaper that apparent indictments were made in Colette's case as well as Gloria Gonzalez's case. Sheriff C.V. Kern stated that secret indictments had been issued. However, the Assistant District Attorney Erwin G. Ernst denied this, stating, quote, "I've been working on these cases and I know indictments have not been returned," end quote. This would not be the first premature media statement made by the sheriff, or like really inappropriate timing as far as media statements go. I'll get into that a little bit, but throughout this episode, you'll see that a lot of what is said really did not need to be said at all. But this is the first instance where we really kind of see that. Irwin actually went on to state that a murder charge had been filed against a man on April 7th in Colette's specific case, but there, quote, "has been no other legal action taken," end quote. The charge was allegedly based on an affidavit from a man who claimed to witness the murder of Colette at the reservoir. I did not see any other sources corroborating this. Then again, I'll kind of explain later the difficulty when it comes to finding information in these cases. Newsflash, it's very difficult and there's very little. Now, according to the Brownwood Bulletin, the sheriff, Captain W.W. Fisher, explained why the murder charge had not been announced at the time, saying, quote, "We haven't arrested him and we were afraid he would run and it would make him harder for us to find," end quote. So this is a sentiment that I can understand, because sometimes you really don't want to jump the gun on things. You don't want to announce to the public that you have a murder charge and then have this guy run away and you can't arrest him, because then you look like an idiot and a joke. So I really understand wanting to play your cards close to your chest, but because of the media issues going on, that really doesn't happen in this case. In fact, a lot gets said to the media that, as I mentioned before, really shouldn't. During a separate investigation pertaining to Rhonda Renee Johnson, somebody else we'll talk about at some point in this investigative series, authorities dismissed the idea that her death could be related to not only Colette's, but Gloria's as well. Now, due to public speculation, authorities eventually changed their sentiment, stating, quote, "We haven't established there is a connection, but there is nothing to rule it out," end quote. This statement specifically was provided by criminal investigator Hugh Irby in the Brownwood Bulletin on January 12th of 1972. You'll see throughout this, if you look at any of the associated newspaper clippings, investigators really flip-flop back and forth on, do we think things are connected? Do we think things are standalone crimes? Do we think these murders have to do with these murders? And there's not really a consensus. Um, so that's also problematic. It's very confusing for the public, and I think honestly it gets kind of confusing for the investigators as well. Now, it, they were kind of in a rock and a hard place at this point in time because more bodies continued to be discovered in Texas, specifically along the I-45 area, and there were growing sentiments of a serial killer being in the area. And this obviously is going to instill a lot of fear and panic in the public, which I can't blame them because we're talking about 34 bodies in this one section of roadway in this one particular state. So there was a reason to be scared. And a lot of people who had young daughters, because that was the demographic that was primarily going missing, were very scared, very terrified, and trying to, protect their children to the best of their ability. But when they didn't have any substantial answers, there's not really much that you can do as a parent. This escalated after 2 bodies were removed from the Taylor Bayou area. Captain J.J. Clavenhagen stated, quote, "There's not reason to think this is a dumping ground for bodies," end quote. Mind you, in an area outside of the Taylor Bayou, Colette and Gloria's bodies were found, right? And then we'll learn that there were the Galveston murders as well. So while maybe they're not all part of one dumping ground in general, there were multiple dumping grounds around the area. And so I think it's really stupid to say, there's no reason to think this is a dumping ground for bodies. Well, obviously that's incorrect. This entire section of the highway is a dumping ground for bodies. But again, they're trying to do damage control. So I understand what the sentiment is, but when you look at the fact that Colette and Gloria's bodies were found 3 days apart from one another, only 80 feet apart from one another, and top of all of the other murders taking place, it's really stupid thing to say. And overall, finding more than one body in like a general vicinity of one another was not going to be a rare phenomenon in this section of the I-45. The search for Colette's body came to an official conclusion when investigators returned to the area where they'd located Gloria's remains. C.V. Kern stated, quote, "We were prompted to search this area again when we discovered that one of the teeth scattered in this area did not belong to Gloria," end quote. Further indicating that Colette's remains were in the area was the finding of her gold piece ring, something that was mentioned earlier in her description at the time of her disappearance. This also kind of lends to the idea that she was killed shortly after being abducted. Kern went on to state this was further confirmed when, quote, "the medical examiner discovered the faulty hip bone," end quote. So Colette was known to walk with a limp, and certain papers stated that was due to a congenital, I don't know the word, but it was basically a genetic related issue with her pelvis. Reports went on to indicate that Colette was known, like I said, to walk with a limp, and that she had specific dental work done as well, which will come in handy later. Obviously, we have to talk a little bit about Gloria right now, even though we're focusing on Colette, because their remains were found in the same area. And what's interesting is that despite not knowing what Colette's cause of death was at the time, it was very clear that Gloria was beaten to death. It was blunt force trauma to the head. Now, both Colette and Gloria's heads were separated from their bodies. However, law enforcement and the medical examiner were very clear that this was most likely due to decomposition, animal activity, weather, rather than straight up decapitation. As if to further highlight the struggles and unpreparedness of law enforcement in this situation, the remains of Colette and Gloria were initially misidentified, and they were actually mixed up. In the Waco News Tribune, it's reported that a skull, which they originally believed was Gloria's, was actually Colette's, and then vice versa. The medical examiner, Dr. G. Sheldon Green, stated the mix-up happened when responding officers thought they'd found all of Gloria's remains when they had, in fact, not. Now, part of the way they determined who was who was, again, like I said, the distinct dental work. Now, Colette was specifically identified through dental records by her father, Mr. Wilson, who happened to be a dentist. I can't imagine what that must have been like for him to be asked to identify the remains. I'm sure some part of him really hoped it wasn't his daughter, but I can almost guarantee you he recognized the work that he'd done right away. And upon confirming that the skull belonged to his daughter, Mr. Wilson stated, quote, "That's her. I'm positive that's Colette. She was very happy, and God was she beautiful," end quote. And while it's a very tragic thing and a very sad thing, I do take comfort in the fact that, and again, I'm speculating here because I don't know what it was like for him, but I feel like there might have been a weird strange of peace to help bring her home, to help identify her and say, yes, that's my baby girl, and ensure that her remains are collected and she can be put to rest properly. Again, I don't know that for a fact. I hope that's a little bit of the sentiment that they had and that Mr. Wilson was able to find comfort in that. But again, I can't speak one way or the other because it wasn't me. As the investigation continued for Colette's disappearance and murder, 6 full time investigators were actually assigned to the case. However, despite an initial influx of leads, they very quickly thinned out. One of the leads presented was a composite sketch based on the statements of a 20-year-old waitress and a 23-year-old housewife, both of whom described a male in his 20s weighing 175 pounds with thick sandy brown hair. The male described was someone who verbally accosted both women in the prior month. This article was published December 2nd, 1971, so this incident would have occurred sometime in early November. Now, in an article published in the San Antonio Light on November 30th, 1975, Kern, who we should be familiar with at this point, stated that he had a suspect in mind for both Colette's death and Gloria's death. Kern described the male to be a former boyfriend of one of the victims. I was unable to figure out who he was referencing, whether it was Colette or Gloria. If I had to speculate, it was probably Gloria, as she was 19 and Colette was only 13. The male was described as being 25 years old, tall, with sandy hair, and approximately 175 pounds. You may have noticed that this description is identical to the description provided by the 2 female witnesses, leading to the composite sketch. Now, I was unable to find a copy of the composite sketch. I don't know if that exists. If it does, that's great. I have not witnessed it myself. On top of that, this really isn't as big of a revelation as I initially thought, because the description that he's providing the public and the media with comes directly from what the women said. So it wasn't like 1 + 1 = 2. It was really just I'm repeating what they told me. So at first I got super excited. I was like, oh my God, it's the same description. And then I took a step back and was like, well, that's how he got the description. It was from that report. As coverage of the case continued, the San Antonio Light went on to report that Colette's cause of death had actually been determined, and that it was determined due to a skull fracture detected during an autopsy. Now, this is the first and only article I was able to find that mentioned head trauma specifically for Colette. However, if Gloria's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, and we assume that Gloria and Colette were killed by the same person, it would make sense that Colette also suffered from the same cause of death. Um, Unfortunately, the information in relation to Colette's case is very slim, as well as the information in Gloria's case. As I mentioned in the opening, I actually had to purchase a newspaper subscription to find any information because a Google search legitimately did not give me anything. I got nothing. So now I'm paying $8 a month to get access to newspapers, which is fine because it's for a good cause. But I do think it's a little bit stupid because this is information that I feel the public should have access to for free, especially in relation to cold cases and unsolved murders. But that's just my take. That said, because I have to pay for this subscription and get this only newspapers, there's nothing that I can find to cross-reference the tabloids with. So who's to say how accurate this information is? I would like to believe that it's fairly accurate, but I'm also not naive enough to, put myself behind it 100%. So understand that some of this should be taken with a grain of salt because there's really no way for me to know otherwise than what is in the paper. That said, we are going to talk about Gloria's case as well, because hers and Colette's basically go hand in hand. That said, I do want to mention that I am trying to go in chronological order. So, Colette's was the first in the I-45 cases, and there were actually 3 other girls that got abducted and murdered in between the space of Colette and Gloria. However, because of how entwined their cases are, I feel like it's only fitting to talk about them at the same time rather than breaking them up. So just keep in mind that there's actually three other cases between the two, which is also why the public was as distressed as they were. So that said, I'm going to go in chronological order to the best of my abilities. If it makes sense to do otherwise, I will let you guys know. So, unlike Colette, Gloria's last known whereabouts are much more vague. According to a couple of sources, Gloria was actually seen on October 28th. This is the last time she was seen alive in the area of her apartment on Jacqueline Street in Houston, Texas. Someone allegedly saw her walking, and that's pretty much it. As mentioned previously, her remains would be found in the same area as Colette's, and that her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. What is of major interest in the papers is that, unlike Colette's case, there were actually several suspects early on in Gloria's case. However, none of them panned out, which is kind of why we're doing this series in the first place. One suspect of particular interest was a 34-year-old man who escaped a mental health facility and consequently abducted a young woman. Now, this man was very mentally ill, but on top of that, he was a former convict for kidnapping, assault, and other really dangerous felonies. The man was ultimately arrested, and authorities actually examined his diaries, where he confessed to several murders. However, they didn't really take that super seriously at the time because a lot of those details for those particular murders were published in the newspaper, so it's not like he knew secret information. The man was ultimately cleared after a polygraph test and a psych evaluation. However, at the time, investigators believed he was responsible due to Gloria's death. He was responsible for Gloria's death due to specific details in the diary that pertained to her case, which were not released to the public. Make of that what you will. Overall, authorities were very quick in Gloria's case to come on the record stating they had suspects and then attempted to paint those people as suspects rather than waiting for evidence to really substantiate the belief that they had. Kern actually went so far as to describe one suspect as a, quote, sex maniac, end quote, before later announcing the same person was actually clear and uninvolved with the crimes. So I want to take a little bit to talk about the media mess ups here because Kern very clearly in his statements, at least to me, looks like a man that is drowning, a man that is way out of his element, way over his head, way out of his league. He is under a lot of pressure to provide the public with answers, and he has no answers. Because again, we have to remember other victims were abducted and murdered before we get to Gloria. At that point, there's four other little girls that have been killed. So a lot of people are going to be freaking out. And at this point in time, women were disappearing left and right and being found dead like it was a hot commodity. It was happening all the time, which is ridiculous, but it was. So, by proposing suspects prematurely to the media, in a way, it's giving the public and the people a false sense of progress, saying, hey, we're doing something, we're looking at this, we're taking it serious. But I also believe that it was a huge detriment to the case because at a certain point, the public's going to stop believing you when you say you have the bad guy because you keep messing it up, because you keep jumping the gun and saying, oh, it's this person, oh, it's this person, oh, it's this person. You're also carelessly and recklessly like ruining these other people's lives by making these statements to the media, which is then mass publicized. Like it's just inappropriate all around, very premature. I do think part of the reason they did this is because we have to remember it's the 1970s, right? It's not 2026. So their resources are significantly smaller than what we have today. Today, we have cell phone data, we have GPS data, we have cameras on every street corner, we have ring cameras, we have satellites. Like everything would work in our favor. Obviously, there's still some cases that are unsolved that don't get solved super easy, but the 1970s situation, they didn't have like advanced DNA evidence. They were in a rock and a hard place, especially with how much this was happening all over the state, especially along the I-45. So we just have to keep that in mind while we look at this. Additionally, on top of everything that I've said, there are details surrounding Gloria's body which are very unclear. In one article, there claims to be a rope that was around her neck that one end was on her and then one end was tied to a nearby tree. And that same article goes on to speculate if Gloria was tortured prior to her death. However, the same speculation is not presented in Colette's case, but it's reasonable to assume that those cases are connected. I was not able to find any other source that shared the same detail that there was a rope involved or anything like that, so who knows how accurate that is. On top of this, you guys are probably like, well, this is a psychology podcast. Where is the analysis? To be completely honest with you, there's not much to analyze. Overall, there is a substantial lack of information pertaining to this case. So I'm going to try and give you what I can, but please understand that, there's really not a lot to go on. I do want to caveat what I'm going to say with the fact that this is really just educated speculation and nothing more. I don't know anything as fact at this point. So take what I have to say with a little bit of a grain of salt. What I did, because I was very curious, is I looked up an image of Gloria and an image of Colette, and I kind of compared the two. And when you look at the image of Gloria and Colette, there's some things that are very noticeable between the two that match up. First and foremost, both girls have very beautiful, dark, thick colored hair, and they have thick, dark colored eyebrows as well. They also both have rather a square-shaped bone structure in their face. And what's really interesting to me about Gloria's photo is that she doesn't look 19 in the photo. Now, I can't confirm exactly when this was taken, so it may be that, she's actually only 13 in the picture. But if she is 19 in that picture, she doesn't look like it. And that may be why the individual abducted her, because she appeared younger than she was. But given the similarities in their appearance and the fact that they were grouped together, this kind of indicates that the killer has a type, which is a weird thing to say, but the overlap has to be noticed. And again, that's assuming that one person killed both of them. We don't know that, but I don't think that's very far off base to say. Because two bodies that are close to each other in the exact same spot really isn't a coincidence. I then actually superimposed a few screenshots of Google Maps images and triangulated the area. Colette's abduction site was much farther away than that of Gloria's. And at this point, I don't have any other data points for this. So without additional data points, it's kind of difficult to say or analyze the little triangulation that I did. But if we can get more geographical information, it might be helpful. I'm sure the FBI has probably already analyzed that, but I just think, why not do it myself? But yeah, so despite not having a lot of information to go off of pertaining to the crime scene itself, as well as the autopsies, we can't even confirm at this point if Colette did have blunt force trauma to the head. I think it's probably likely, but there's really just not a lot to extrapolate on. So I really feel like there's kind of two distinct options here. One, it's a young male. Someone the girls may be more willing to trust because he's closer in age to them. He's not as scary. It's not as much of a stranger danger situation. So they may have an easier time trusting him or believing him. On the flip side, it could be an older man who has the strength, the means, the motive, the opportunity to overpower them, who doesn't really focus on, hey, you have to trust me, but can really just kind of get away with snatching them up and taking them somewhere else. What would be helpful to know in regards to Gloria and Colette's case is whether they were killed at the reservoir or dumped there. Some speculate they were dumped, others speculate they were killed. If they were dumped, this suggests if they were dumped, it suggests that somebody actually has an isolated place to not only kill the girls, but potentially sexually assault them or torture them. If we go off of what was speculated in Gloria's case, we don't really have a way of knowing one way or the other, but that's important too, right? If you're dumping the body, that means there was another location first. If you are killing them in there and then leaving their bodies at the reservoir, that's a little bit different. That signifies that they don't have a place that they can go to. They can't self-isolate, etc. Maybe they have a family at home. Maybe they are transient and they don't have a place that they can comfortably do this in, etc. What we do know for a fact is that Gloria was killed violently. And this indicates somebody who not only has a lot of anger, but has a lot of strength and a lot of power. This individual is very fine and okay with being up close and personal with death and violence, because this was not a simple execution. It's not like he did whatever he wanted with Gloria and then just shot her in the back of the head and she died instantly. This was intended to be painful and violent. Again, I recognize that all of this is very vague, but really there is not a lot to work with when it comes to the coverage of Colette and Gloria's cases. I don't know what it's going to be like for any of the others involved in this, but that's kind of where we're at right now. We also have to keep in mind that whoever killed Gloria and Colette may not be responsible for any of the other murders on the I-45, or they could be responsible for all of them. There's a lot of options open. Now, something that came up during a documentary I watched, it was the Texas Killing Fields documentary on Netflix, was how much turmoil and turnover there was in Texas at the time. There was an economic boom taking place, so people were moving in and out of Texas like crazy, like a bunch of flies on a horse. The population swelled. People were getting jobs left and right, and background checks weren't really a thing. They weren't a requirement, and they weren't as readily implemented as they are today. Again, the 1970s compared to 2026. So it's likely that there are multiple killers that may have moved into the city and have long since left the city. There's not really a way of knowing, and if that's the case, this is going to complicate things a lot. But there's also a chance that one of the killers, the killer, whoever it may be, is also local, because that would also make a lot of sense. Ultimately, right now, we just kind of have to keep our options open. At this point, I don't have much else to say on Colette and Gloria's cases. Not a lot of information. I wish I had more to provide you guys, but I'm going to keep digging and finding what I can on all of these cases because I think they're all independently important. Because, I mean, honestly, the phenomenon of the I-45 is insane to me. How does this happen? How does it keep happening? You know what I mean? So I think it's worth investigating. And who knows? Maybe somebody knows something somewhere and they don't realize they do until they hear about every single case individually. So if you want to support my deep dive in this investigation, the coverage, whatever it is that you want to call it, please consider supporting me by liking, commenting, and subscribing. All of that helps. As ridiculous as it sounds, it helps fund my newspaper subscription that I now have, which honestly I probably should have gotten sooner, but it's nice to have it now. Better late than never. But yeah, too many of these cases are unsolved. Like that's really what it boils down to. And they've kind of been forgotten about over time, and people have really thrown their hands up in the air and thought, well, there's nothing else we can do about it. I personally doubt that I'm going to find anything new and shocking as far as information goes, but you also never know. Like, stranger things have happened. Some people who are internet detectives, if you will, end up solving cases that otherwise would go unnoticed. And like I said, any attention on these is important. So I hope that you'll stay with me through the series as we attempt to get justice on the I-45 for the victims as well as the families. And hopefully we can spread some word about, the weird stuff that's going on the I-45, specifically in Texas. So tell your friends, don't hang out there. It's a bad place. Don't do it. Just drive straight through. Don't stop for anybody. Don't look at anybody. Don't even smile. Just keep going. That's all I have for you guys. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I hope you guys had a great Mother's Day. And please, please, please take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there and stay psyched out.